India and China being very large markets, of course, they've seen very major increases in their shares of imports into the East Africa region over the last 2 decades, to the extent that China and India alone now account for nearly 40% of all imports into the East African community. So that's the kind of scale of problem. So in this open introduction, I've just tried to contrast a little bit the arguments between small scale and large scale, and come to a few major points for discussion here. So the first is, I think it's a time to talk up intra-African trade. Intra-Africa trade has a much more greater economic significance than commonly is understood. And we have some mistaken figures on the actual import of intra-African trade. A third point, African firms on average are much smaller than their global competitors, and this makes it more difficult for them to compete. And so the question becomes, should we be celebrating smallness? A question I'd like to put to people quickly is, which is the most entrepreneurial country in the world? I was reading a Gallup poll survey globally of entrepreneurial spirit some time ago, and noted that most people would respond, they would expect an answer like the United States or a high-income economy as being one of the most entrepreneurial. In actual fact, it was Uganda. Uganda came up tops in terms of the number of people that replied positively to the question, were they planning over the next 12 months to open up a business? And 80% of Ugandans interviewed replied positively to that. Whereas in the United States, I believe the figure was 5 or 6%, and in countries like Germany, it was 3%. And of course, that reflects survival strategies on the part of Ugandans, because the formal sector jobs are not there. So they need to be entrepreneurial in that sense. One point I think it would be important to point out is that under the AfCFTA, some of the motives for small-scale cross-border trade actually might disappear. Amongst economists, we measure regional integration by what is called the law of one price, which means once those trade barriers have been eliminated amongst member states of the AfCFTA, you should see a gradual convergence of prices, that services and goods should cost more similar prices across markets if they're fully integrated. Now, that's happened to some extent in the European Union, although not in all markets. And you would expect to see some of that on the African continent. And so in some cases, you will see actually some of the vibrant cross-border trade that we see at the moment disappearing, because it will be possible to import and export without paying those tariffs. There will still be a lot of vibrancy for cross-border trade in agricultural produce, for example. Some areas of the continent will have geographic advantages in terms of producing certain goods and services. So there'll be plenty of scope for small cross-border trade, but its nature will change. It won't be. My final 2 points. I believe it's a mistake to believe that big players on the African continent can take care of themselves. I had an interesting discussion with a representative of Bakreza, the Tanzanian company. Bakreza started as a very small company in the 1970s, but now is a company which has operations across 7 or 8 African countries. And one of their managers said to me that they had a lot of problems of importing maize from a neighboring country because of the non-tariff barriers and the like. So I think it's not the case that major players don't have significant problems and hurdles in terms of intra-African trade currently. In the words of Thandika Makandawire, the renowned Malawian economist, he says the failure to bring on board these big business interests is tantamount to a performance of Hamlet without the prince. We are talking here as bureaucrats and academics, and the actual big actors are not involved, and we don't fully understand what their interest is. So this was Makandawire talking about the importance of dialogue with big business as well as the small enterprises in terms of realization of AfCFTA goals. So my final point here is that policies are needed for all sizes of companies, not just for the small scale cross-border traders. Clearly, that's an important element and it's going to be focus of our discussions today. There's a lot of issues to discuss around that. So for example, the simplified trade regimes that we've seen adopted in COMESA and East African community have been proved very useful for small scale traders, I think, across the region in terms of facilitating their movement across borders. So there's plenty to discuss on that. But my final appeal here is just not to ignore any segment of the African business community here as we move towards implementation of the AfCFTA. And the large players are also important. Well, thank you very much. I hope I haven't run too much over time with those introductory remarks, but I hope it sets the scene for a lively discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that very good opening remark. It's been extremely interesting and it's extremely useful for our participants. I want to now hand over the floor to Dr. Mangeni, who will be moderating the panel discussion, and hopefully some of these insights will also be dealt with at a deeper level by the panelists. So Dr. Mangeni, you have the floor. I also want to welcome our panelists who will also be able to be visible on the shared screen in a minute. So thank you very much. Dr. Mangeni, I hand it to you. Thanks.
Right. So thank you so much, Diana. My gratitude to you, Diana, and to Alan for having taken the lead in bringing this webinar about. We are extremely grateful to you. And as you said at the beginning, and we would like to tell all the participants, this is not the first and the last. It's the first of many, many, many more to come on topical issues. So please watch this space and stay attuned. Secondly, I would like to thank our colleague Andrew Mould, who, as he said from the beginning, has made quite a provocative presentation for some, but not at all for me, because I'm really happy with his presentation. He has disabused us of this crying over low intra-Africa trade without unpacking actually the figures. He has shown us actually, according to my notes, that for some countries, their participation in intra-Africa trade ranges all the way to 85% ascertained, or to 30%. So that's beyond what we have been talking about usually. And he has explained why, it's the distortion from the big economies, structural characteristics, gave the example of Angola, which is really indisputable. And then, of course, the undervalued share of small-scale or informal cross-border trade in Africa. And now, I have got the pleasure to introduce a panel to you, which is going to look further into all these issues. Now, as the panelists will be engaging us, I would like to appeal to you, the participants, to be active in the chat box, Q&A. Please tell us what you think. Share with us your views. Make recommendations which we can carry forward. I think Diana told us that we will be trying to come up with some recommendations. Now, I would like to introduce the panelists, and they are as follows. First of all, though they are not going to be speaking in this order necessarily, Alan, who is the Chief of Programs at the TradeMark East Africa, and Diana was beginning to introduce her already. Now, I would like to suggest that when Alan takes the floor, she can tell us a little bit more about herself, because her bio is actually so many pages. It will take me a long time to go through, her entire bio. And then we have got Sheila, who is the Executive Director of the Eastern Africa Sub-Regional Support Initiative for the Advancement of Women. So she's going to tell us about the role of women, and we have heard how they have quite a big share in intra-Africa small-scale trade. And then we have Jakob, who is the country economist for the International Growth Center, the branch in Kampala. That's where he's based. And then we have Ziad, who is the chairman of the Ghana chapter of Borderless Alliance, which is a continental non-governmental organization. And then we have Philo, who is a policy officer with the European Center for Development Policy Management, who is also going to share with us her perspective. So this is our panel. It is really a blockbuster panel, and we couldn't have had a better panel than this to discuss a small-scale trade or informal trade. It's very gender balanced indeed. So now, I would like to make some observations before I call upon Philo to kick us off. First of all, every small-scale enterprise or every person who participates in small-scale trade can actually potentially have access to the entire global market or regional market like the East African community, or the continental market like the African Continental Free Trade Area, because we've got the technology to do this, the market information systems to do this, and the digital trade, which can allow us to jump over the hurdles of brand awareness, getting to brand awareness, prevalent brand awareness, advertising, and of course, reaching out to markets. So there's that potentiality. How can it come about? Secondly, using an all government and all people approach, we should build better inclusive economies and societies. Without inclusiveness, everything goes up in smoke. As we have been told, for instance, by Joseph Stiglitz, the price of informality is too high. Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you.
All right.
I hear you.
Yes, there's something which happened to my screen. I thought you're not hearing me. Yes, I was saying the price of lack of inequality is too high, whether it's in terms of social unrest, or as we have seen lately through populist movements, through the sorts of leaders that we can have, and through the tearing down of global rule books, which of course creates, existential problems for humankind. If we don't have a global economic order, if we don't have a global governance structure, then everything becomes, a territory for pirates, so to speak, which is not sustainable at all. So inclusiveness is extremely important. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area aims to be inclusive through creating decent jobs and incomes and through structural transformation. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area will lead to policy reforms through its implementation, which will improve the ease of doing business, including for SMEs, as well as small-scale cross-border trade. For instance, initiatives such as those that aim to address non-tariff barriers, that aim to deal with the standards, the harmonization of standards, or at least mutual recognition, customs facilitation, including simplified trade regimes, and then, of course, market intelligence institutions or initiatives such as the Africa Trade Observatory, the URL for which is ato.africa. The URL for NTBs is tradebarriers.africa. So these initiatives will help us. Of course, though COVID has hit us really big time, we know from estimates now or projections that we are beginning to recover. For instance, this year, 2021, we expect the African economy to grow by 3.4%, though it contracted last year by 2.1%, which was equivalent to $145 to $190 billion in GDP losses. We still need a lot of money to recover, equivalent estimated, and now at 450 billion in funding gaps. Of course, we have a huge debt to GDP ratio, which has risen to anywhere between 70% and 75%, which is unsustainable. Job losses, 30 million have gone into extreme poverty in the year 2020. This year, maybe it might go into, we might have a figure of 39 million who go into extreme poverty. So we have the challenge to really build back better. And therefore, small-scale trade, this is where poverty is, and this is where people are trying to do something about it themselves through their own initiatives to try to do something about eradication or elimination of poverty in their homes and in their lives. So now let me begin with you, Philo. What do you think are some of the reasons which bring about small-scale trade? Can we expect it to continue? Bearing in mind that we need policy reforms so that small companies can grow, and so that trade can be done easier. So over to you, Philo, if you can please make your intervention.
Good afternoon, my fellow panelists in the audience. Thank you so much, Dr. Mangeni, Francis, if I may, for that kind introduction, and of course to Diana, Alan, and the team for organizing the event. I am definitely very glad to be part of this initial dialogue series ahead of course, Africa Integration Day tomorrow. So just to answer the question that you posed, what are some of the motivations behind informal trade? So at ECDPM, we recently had a study together with Endaka Seed, based in West Africa, examining exactly this question. What is the problematic of informal cross-border trade, and how can we then address it? And in doing so, our study sort of questions key assumptions that support common ICBT engagement programs. Some of them that you've heard from what was shared by Andrew earlier on, issues about, of course, underreporting of the share of small-scale trade as a whole when measuring inter-African trade. But of course, before proposing a solution, let's just really look back to what is the problem. So to start off, we found that there's no clear working definition of what informal cross-border trade involves. And it's viewed very differently by different actors, which of course then determines how you will develop engagement strategies. So we found that informal cross-border trade in West Africa varies depending, for example, on the actor type. Are we speaking about small-scale traders engaging in survivalist activities? Or are we looking at large organized traders outside the formal sphere? Also, the motivations or incentives are very important. Is it to avoid taxation, or is it rather avoidance because there are legitimate reasons like high costs at the borders? Even the type of good traded determines the choice to continue in the informal sector. For example, are you trading illicit goods like vegetables and fruits, or are these highly regulated goods like rice in the case of Nigeria, or illegal goods like arms and drugs? And then the regulatory environment and compliance institutions also matter. You find that if you have cumbersome and complicated procedures at the border, then people are more likely to try and avoid this by engaging formally. So our study sort of wanted to look underneath the problem of informal cross-border trade and look at the perspectives of how it's viewed by three main actors. So for our study, we looked at the perspectives of the traders themselves, the state, and the border officials. So we found that from the traders' perspective, most of them generally engaged in ICBT as a form of survival, given the lack of other productive opportunities. As Andrew corrected us, 85% of employment opportunities are actually in the informal sector. So you find that most people, because of maybe other macroeconomic deficiencies in the countries, can find another alternative. So they see this as a way to engage in business. However, from the consumer side, it's actually seen as something legitimate in their eyes, because it's seen as a way of getting across affordable goods, including food products and other consumer goods. But then when you speak to them, a lot of the traders voice, of course, concerns around safety and security at the border. Bribery and harassment by border officials were often cited. And then there was also a very interesting perspective of how they saw the state. So they said in some borderlands, the state actually has no degree of legitimacy required for them to comply with the rules and regulations in place. Rather, they would seek to avoid complying with these rules and regulations to minimize financial time and costs. And when we're speaking about West Africa, you cannot discount the historic and social context of informal trade routes, that have also predated the modern state as we know it today, and the role of social networks. So there's a long shared history, for example, between Mali and Senegal, dating back to the Mali Empire, and traders are often a part of a larger distribution network, hence longer value chains. So for them, whether it was engaging in informal cross-border trade, it was also driven by other social factors in which, for example, they saw ICBT as an opportunity to take advantage of trade, but also arbitrage, selling goods at different prices. Then we also had interviews with some state officials, and for them it was more, their perspective was to sort of discipline informal traders with broader objectives around issues like state building and modernity. Of course, they had issues around concerns for health and safety issues when you speak about SPS. Also security concerns with some of the permeable borders and issues of terrorism in some of the countries in West Africa, around trade of illegal goods like arms, but also gold that was then used to finance some of these terrorist activities.
Yes, exactly. Fellow. Yeah, actually, could you tell us more about the types of products that are predominantly traded on a small scale basis, and also what the implications are? For Africa.
So the type of goods that were predominantly traded, we found from the borders we saw was mostly foodstuffs. So it was a lot of consumable goods, perishable goods, which then had implications for transportation. Was this easily facilitated across the border if you're, for example, trading tomatoes? But we also found that for some of the products being sold, they needed to have SPS clearance. And in some of the cases, the traders had not received the necessary documentation to have some of these goods transported. So sought to use informal trade routes to avoid detection by the officials. So in terms of implications, what do we see in terms of the goods being traded? Firstly, in terms of the STRs, as Andrew had mentioned before, most of these goods really are at a low consignment. So there's a necessity to have simplified trade regimes in place to aid some of these traders to be able to move the goods much faster, to avoid delays at the border with complex procedures. And we've seen examples already in place, for example, in COMESA, where they have a simplified trade regime in place. However, from our study, we found that it's not so straightforward that if you have an SDR in place, then automatically you have fixed the problem. So some of the people we spoke to said, well, it's one thing to only have a simplification of procedure related to rules of origin, but we also need help with, for example, the rigorous SPS, other licenses and certificates, other taxes and fees on goods. So this is some of the issues I think going forward with policy, we need to look at how to simplify holistically the process. And then we also looked at some of the goods were also regulated goods in terms of the domestic policy of some of the countries. For example, Nigeria had stricter rules when it came to importing rice because they had concerns about smuggling. So then this points to the policy implications for better regulation of intra-trade, especially when there's a problem of smuggling. So this is also an area that needs to be strengthened in terms of trade facilitation to avoid some of these smuggling opportunities.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
So
right.
I think I can stop here for now, but
yes, we shall. Yes, you will come back again. You will come back again. Yeah, thanks so much for highlighting, some of the reasons actually why small-scale trade takes place and what types of products are traded. Now, I would like to turn to Jakob. Would you say that a small-scale trade actually is a driver of economic growth? And could you tell us your experience regarding small-scale cross-border trade between Uganda and South Sudan? And not that you participated, but from your research, what have you been able to observe? Well, I used actually to be a small-scale trader when I was a boy. I grew up in Butiaba, so it is all right. It's all right. Now, so what's the experience as between Uganda and South Sudan? And what actually drives this informal cross-border trade? So can you let's have a conversation around two or three issues.
Sure.
Over to you,
thanks,
Jakob.
Thanks again for inviting me to this panel. It's a super interesting discussion. Just one brief remark on what Philomena just highlighted. I do think with small scale and informal cross-border trade, I actually think there have been a couple of attempts to get away from the term of informal cross-border trade because it might imply illegality. And so, like, if we look at initiatives like the small trade regimes in EASSI or in COMESA, I think in SADC as well, I think there are attempts to legalize this form of trade as well. Though again, it depends very much, as Philomena highlighted, on what you're trading, weapons vis-a-vis food items. Okay, so on the relationship of informal cross-border trade between Uganda and South Sudan, I think like what we did in a study conducted jointly with the World Bank is we were interested in understanding how the civil conflict did not only affect South Sudan itself, but how the civil conflict affected economies around. And specifically, we're interested in the trade channel. And so the general research question here was like, how did this crisis in an important trading partner affect formal exports, so exports that are conducted by people that own trucks, that have access to adequate means of finance, that are relatively large firms, and informal exports. And in this case, in the case of Uganda, this really means normally poor and female persons who typically live in close vicinity to the affected borders, and who typically rely on like very simple means of transport, such as their feet or, you know, push carts and stuff like that. And like to just frame the importance of that question is it's crucial to re-emphasize that in the case of Uganda, but also other countries in the EASSI, informal cross-border trade is really massive. So for Uganda specifically, informal cross-border exports are about 40% of formal exports to the immediate neighboring countries. So like that's a really, really high number that I think reflects a little bit of what Andrew Mould highlighted earlier. And so the key result that we found was that formal exports to South Sudan took a significant hit. So they went down by about 12% in the study. In economic terms, 12% is really massive. But what we found when we looked at the informal cross-border trade exports is that we found that they basically disappeared. So a hit of 80% downwards. And so this means two things for the region. One is that, of course, poor traders in Uganda's north lost a very important form of import of earnings. But on the other side around, South Sudan is very highly dependent on, for example, cereal imports from Uganda. They're not food self-sufficient. So again, re-emphasizing this tremendous role that informal cross-border trade or small-scale trade plays in from a social perspective. And I think from a broader perspective, what we learned is that these two types of trade are really quite different, thereby like giving us a couple of ideas for future research projects, which brings me to your second question about whether I think, personally, from my very limited experience in this field, whether small-scale trade can be a driver of economic growth. And I think I'm gonna disagree on that. So I do think informal cross-border trade plays a very important role in distributing goods and used goods, so either agri-food items or maybe used clothes, etc. But I would doubt that, or maybe one important research question, scale traders really have the same sort of like key characteristics of normal formal firms, for example, a manufacturing firm, that makes them so interesting to economic growth. And economic growth and for exporting, of course, also means that like as these firms grow, more employment and social benefits are being generated. So in economics, we tend to think that exporting is a good thing because it allows formal firms to grow and overcome a limited market size and take advantage of this greater market access. Exporters may also learn from, learning about foreign technologies and bring them back home. They might also, grow from competition. But the question really whether this is really true for this type of like small scale trade. So could it really be that this is simply a distribution service that takes care of or takes advantage of price differentials between different markets? So in the preparation for this webinar, we discussed, for example, the case of a trader of a person in Goma traveling in Kigali, traveling to Goma to buy used clothes and come back because they're less expensive there. Or do they actually exhibit these like sort of like desirable features of normal exporters that make like greater market access so interesting? The last point that I want to make in terms of what drives informal cross-border trade, and maybe also the role of the AfCFTA in all of this, it's like one of the key features of the AfCFTA is a massive trade liberalization on the continent. However, what we find, for example, in the EASSI, where bilateral tariffs between member states are actually at zero for most cases, informal cross-border trade is still very, very high. So we might want to look into other issues that drive informal cross-border trade. I don't think it's tariffs. And I also don't think that the AfCFTA will play a huge role in boosting informal cross-border trade. I rather think it's, all the NTBs. I think it's like very unsafe border environments. And that has some implications for policies in terms of like what we want to target, trade facilitation initiatives, one-stop border posts, simplification of trade regimes, getting rid of a lot of red tape in terms of like accessing export licenses and SPF licenses. I'll stop there.
Yeah, yes, Jacob, yes. Now, before you go, I want to ask you a question. Supposing this a given small scale trader is actually a small to medium scale enterprise, right? Maybe they engage in some production activities, whether it's in the agricultural sector or in some other sector, maybe even light manufacturing, maybe. And then from there, they engage in cross-border trade. They try actually to sell what they are producing. So they are not simply distributing, but there's also, that linkage back into the production. Would you modify your answer in such a scenario, or would you still say they are not drivers of economic growth?
Well, they could become, right? I think the example that Mr. Andrew Moore gave at the beginning about the Tanzania company, I'm sure I mispronounced the name, Barasa, they also started off small. So I don't want to exclude that possibility. And again, like reflecting on Philomena's comments, I think like one thing that is so crucial about informal cross-border trade, everybody's talking about something else. When we talk about formal exports, everything is rather standardized. We have the harmonized system nomenclature. The data is collected through the AfCFTA software, which was developed by the World Customs Union back in the 1950s. For informal cross-border trade, many people measure something completely different. So again, taking the research agenda kind of like view, I think one important step would be to come across with a common definition that we could work with. And as a first item, I would suggest we drop the unfortunate informality term, which is associated with illegality. So that'd be my reply.
Right. Yes, I think you have made that point very well. That we, instead of referring to informality, we could maybe refer to small scale trade, because actually, when you refer to informality, you are raising a conceptual issue. Are you trying to promote informality or not? Whereas I think we've been all the while talking about formalization and how to assist these traders to grow in the formal economy rather than the informal economy. So I think that point has been well made. Now, I would like to next to turn to you, Sheila. You've worked quite a lot in this area of small scale trade, on the ground, actually, mobilizing women. So in light of the COVID pandemic, which has hit us really bad, can you give us, some sense of what the impact or the adverse impact has actually been? And maybe you can discuss some gender dynamics of cross-border trade and aspects of inclusion. And how have cooperatives adapted? And how can they be facilitated? Because, this issue of agglomeration of bulking can actually help us, get around some of these problems that we are beginning to hear about small scale trade. So over to you, Sheila, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Francis. And also thanks to Andy and the panelists. Thanks to Alan and Diana for putting this webinar together. I will talk from a point of a former legislator of the East African Parliament. Actually, the parliament I sat in deliberated on the customs union in 2005, and also as an activist from the NGO side. I think before I go into the cooperatives and the COVID-19, maybe one of the things as I listened to Jakob and also listened to Andrew's presentation, one of the things that clearly comes out is about the understanding of ICBTs or the informal cross-border traders by the policymakers. When we were deliberating about the customs union then, one of the things I clearly remember, the big traders or the big players had a very big lobby group coming into Arusha every other day to deliberate with technical people, to really talk to parliamentarians about what trade means. I don't remember any informal cross-border traders also coming to give us their views. So in essence, they are actually out of the policy discussions. Now, working with them at EASSI, I found clearly a different perspective. I think if I had the knowledge I have now of the women cross-border traders and even the men cross-border traders we work with, maybe we would have come out with better policies. Sometimes we trust, I think as citizens, we over-trust the legislators or the policymakers that they know these things. You'll find that most of the border areas are extremely remote. Most of the policymakers have never visited any of those border areas. These are highly marginalized. They are poverty-stricken. So they really lack all the facilities. Most borders actually don't even have banks, for example, and we are talking about financial inclusiveness. We are talking about issues of infrastructure. Most borders are hard to reach areas. And the policymakers kind of do not know these things because they don't go there. We sit and listen to people that come to do the lobbying. So it's a completely a different scenario when now you are working with the actual players and listening to them. So working with the women cross-border traders, as a EASSI, we work at 20 borders areas within the East African community area. We are being supported by TradeMark East Africa to do our work. And the challenges we find is that, which have even been more amplified by COVID-19, the lack of finances, trade facilitation, issues of inadequate border infrastructure. These people have been criminalized for generations. Most of the cross-border traders are known as smugglers. And really, even going to the formal structures, the one-stop border posts that have been built, many of them even fear to interact with border agencies, which is extremely unfortunate, I would say, because even now with COVID-19, of course, they are more criminalized, especially the women who are trying to, they have actually, the women we had brought into the formal have now gone back to the informal because of the border closures. These people, trade is a livelihood. They trade to sustain their families. So when borders are closed, they know all the porous borders, so they go back. And I think it is even more lucrative to do the informal trade than the formal one. So I'm sure we are going to have a big challenge bringing them back to the formal. But the other thing we've done as a EASSI, we are trying to cluster the cross-border traders, because having locked down the borders last year with the close lockdowns, we now began discussing with the women cross-border traders to cluster. And if they are trading in one commodity, they form a cooperative and they are able to transport, buy collectively, negotiate, and find buyers as a collective entity. And I think that one, it's working with us for now, and many of them are seeing that actually it can work, because even the financiers, people who we've been talking to banks, and they're saying it is risky to finance the women cross-border traders because they are not bankable, they don't have security, they move from one border to another, but joining them as cooperatives, then they are able to trade as big entities. And I think that is an area where we should be thinking, how do we encourage and build the capacity of the informal cross-border traders to come together and trade as bigger entities, and then also connect them to the production chain? Because we always say they sell to the final consumer. Maybe they could sell to industries. Maybe they could sell to other people who will add value, or even them, they can be encouraged to add value and sell their products with, moving away from the low value products that Philomena was talking about. So.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Sheila. You made some very interesting points. Now, I wanted to ask you a question. Have you been using warehouse receipt systems, for instance, where these cooperatives come, deposit their goods, and you issue them a receipt, maybe which they can use for getting credit or loans? Does this feature anywhere in what you do? But otherwise, I really appreciate these points you have made about cooperatives as a good practice, and also the observation that it is actually possible for policy reversals to happen. You bring them into the formal sector and then they go back if you don't, for instance, take care of developments such as the COVID crisis. Instead of criminalizing them, if you don't facilitate them, then they could fall back into the informal again. But could you say something about the warehouse system? Maybe it is something you are comfortable talking about.
Yes, that is one of the things that is being experimented, I think, at the Busia border, whereby they are able to bring their products. I hope this is what you mean, where they are able to bring their products and clear them in smaller quantities as the case may be. So it is something, I think, that is being experimented at very few borders.
Yeah,
but
right.
Something which actually would be required, would be needed if we are building the infrastructure for cross-border trade to incorporate the small scale, the small players.
Right. Yeah. Right. So that can also help. That can also help. It can also help. Yes, it can also help. But I also like this point of the disconnect between policymaking and stakeholders, where we need input from stakeholders before we make policy. I think that was an extremely important system. But I would like to strongly suggest that we look into this warehouse receipt system, because it's basically a natural development from having cooperatives, that you build a facility, some people call them trading houses, where these small scale traders who are in cooperatives can come and they're like collection centers, come and, shall I say, deposit all their products, and then in bulk, those products can be sold. But then as and when they deposit their products, you issue them with a receipt, which acknowledging receipt of the products. Now, this receipt can actually be used as a security for getting credit. So thank you so much, Sheila, for sharing with us your perspectives as a lawmaker, and also as an activist, and as a change agent who has actually helped many small-scale traders to make a living and to survive. Now, I would like to turn to you, Ziad. What lessons can be learned from cross-border trade in West Africa, where you operate and where you have been operating very successfully? In fact, you are the president of the Ghana chapter of Borderless Alliance, which tries to help with trade facilitation. So share with us some of the lessons. And how can cross-border traders be empowered to engage more broadly in the policy process? In fact, now you're coming just after Sheila, who as a legislator has observed that there's sometimes, hiatus, there's a disconnect between policymaking and contributions that could be useful if made from stakeholders. So over to you, Ziad, please.
Thank you very much. The only challenge when you are coming after such a fantastic lineup of speakers is that you will end up as an omnibus of various ideas. And so we've opened up the floor so widely on all of the issues that we touched upon. Many of the issues which I would more or less rehash. But so let me try to pull the threads back together a bit and start with the following two remarks. The first one is that in the longer term and the future of Africa, we have 16 landlocked countries which interact with 44 coastal countries. And so in the long term, cross-border trade continue to happen under various forms, whether it's the form of import or export or transit, whether formal or informal. It is a practice life and one of the basics of trade. The other point is that with the lack of appropriate incentives at the remote borders in infrastructure investment, border communities will remain largely informal because of the lack of incentives to change from the modus operandi. So let me roll back a little bit. Let me go back to, and in response to the brilliant presentation from Philomena and from my brother Andrew Walsh, it reminds me a bit of an ancient Indian story about the blind men who were asked to describe an elephant. And then each of them grabs a part of the elephant and attempts to describe the whole. And so the one who grabs the tail will say that an elephant is like a rope. And then the one who touches the side says an elephant is like a wall. And the one who catches the foot would say the elephant is like a fixed snake catch, and so on and so on. And I guess the reason this story came to mind is because we are trying to discuss trade facilitation at the core of all of our discussions. And eventually, trade facilitation can be a lot of things depending on which kind of stakeholders are involved. And here I start with some of my comments, because without access to meaningful data of what is going on at the border, how can we come up with meaningful policies that represent these various groups? And from this one, I was thinking about a different question, a subset of it, which says, what does the informal cross-border trade operator need? We really know what the ICBT is. And the flip coin of that question is that what does policymakers want from ICBT operators? I see a lot of discussion around policies and the need to formalize or to support informal sectors. And most of the time, we fail to recognize the fact that private economic operators and formalized traders have very particular needs and very different from the needs of the smaller scale traders, whether they are formal or informal, and that the policy is supposed to take care of the needs of these various groups. But then the policymakers need to identify the stakeholders to talk to, and they need to look at information which tries to describe what is actually going on the floor in order to respond with an appropriate measure. And so most of the time, I get this impression that we have a difficulty in coming up with a value proposal that balances compliance of the informal sector against the facilitation. I see that there is a need for the informal cross-border trader or the small-scale cross-border traders for that kind of facilitation, but I do not see the value proposal where you have to give something in order to get something, whether we're talking about tax, whether we're talking about a certain levy, whether we're talking about a certain collaboration, information, whatever the value proposal is, something in exchange of something else. We are yet to see what kind of proposal we can have in order to convince, to motivate, to incentivize, call it what you want, the informal traders to become formal. And Doc, let me ask you a question here, something to ponder. Would you prefer a formal, incompetitive trader or an informal, competitive trader? Because informal sector doesn't mean incompetitive. There are two different descriptions. You can be informal and you can be successful, but you can be formal and you can be unsuccessful. Unfortunately, for example, in Ghana today, there's the news of a long-established cashew factory, which employs up to 1,000 people called Min Cashew. And they just folded up for the lack of the ability to compete. And so 1,000 families' livelihoods just went up in smoke, whether it is directly caused by COVID, induced by COVID, or because of a structural issue and challenge in competitiveness, but the fact remains the same. Competitiveness is key, and then there is a certain need for trade facilitation across borders. I'm sorry, I didn't want to make this too long. I'm down to the very important two ideas. So the first one is that the need to recognize that the needs of the formal and informal traders are different, and that we need to address them as such. And finally, today, we know that, for example, in West Africa, the trade is not impacted, but the border communities themselves have been severely impacted by the lack of the ability to move across the borders. And so this brings us back to the question, what do we want with the cross-border trade? And because if border communities and their economic livelihoods are not protected, you'll find yourself in issues that are way beyond the current concern of trade facilitation. So what's the way forward?
Right.
That's all I want to say. I hand over to you.
Right. So now, yes, you asked me a question. I would like to answer it and then maybe hear what you have to say. So then I would prefer a competitive formal trader. I don't want to have to choose between a competitive informal trader and an uncompetitive formal trader. I don't want to be put in that situation. I like to see a competitive formal trader. Now, the reason why is because you see informality is actually a problem across Africa, in that it traps some of our people into perpetual poverty. they are perpetually operating at a small, unsustainable level. Whereas, well, if they have no option out of that, maybe then you can say, all right, that's all they can do. But it would be better if they had options, if they explored options to break out of this vicious cycle in which they are operating so that they can grow, in fact. I think that's the message that we have heard right from Andy, from Jakob, from Sheila, the need for policy support, for interventions actually on the ground to help these people who are trying to eradicate poverty from their homes and from our economies to grow. I think this is what we need to be looking at. Now, having said that, also now regarding these blind men who went to look at the elephant, I think they should have just used their braille. They are reading gadget. Then they would have known what an elephant actually looks like instead of trying to tag, one part. Yeah, but anyway, Ziad, what do you think about this issue of trying to come up with actually interventions? You mentioned policy, the need for policy. Maybe the need to incentivize these operators to formalize and to grow. Do you think this is feasible, or we should just forget about it? If you're a government official, is this something you as Ziad would urge governments, legislators to try to do, to incentivize these small-scale traders to formalize and to grow?
Well, Doc, there are several ways where you can actually deal formally with the informal sector without setting up standards that are too high for them to reach. I think the first step, in my opinion, is to encourage the formation of associations which speak up on behalf of large groups of traders, and to also create this kind of visibility for those who are actually in the trade, in the industry, in particular geographic area. And this will create a contact point for beginning of engagement and for successful communication about setting the priorities and the challenges on both sides, building the trust, building an agenda, and then moving forward with it. So the reason I'm saying that is because we've all done this studies. We've all visited the border crossings in West Africa. Borderless Alliance, we've done that so many times along the Abidjan-Lagos corridor, along the Dakar, Niamey, along the northbound corridors, and we've seen situations. So the needs are pretty much fairly standard and pretty basic. Decent crossing areas, decent facilities, certain simplified trade procedures, capacity building in terms of the tools, the skills, and the resources that are needed. So these are basically universal suggestions. My thinking goes beyond what needs to be done in order to prevent the creation of this kind of funnel. Or let me also use this kind of allegory where people are standing under a fruit tree and they are opening their mouth and waiting for the fruit to fall inside. So if you create a system where people just wait to be supported to become more competitive, then you're not breaking the cycle. If you create a system where both parties have a value proposal that is mutually accepted and recognized, that is where you start to break the cycle. Right. I think data is the new goal. Right. I think data is the new goal. And I think the border communities are sitting on gold mines. Right. And they should be meant to explore as their own contributions. If you give the information with regard to the types of goods, volumes, and amounts of goods that are flowing through your system, in exchange for some kind of facilitation capacity building, I think that's a fair proposal. I think that is a constructive way to build a sustainable ecosystem and to build the kind of trust at the border communities, which allows resilience, economic resilience, and also a more competitive environment.
Right. Yes, a sustainable ecosystem and trust at the border. I think those are extremely brilliant points. And I also like the idea of simplified trade regimes, which can be put in place to facilitate these traders. And the idea of value chains, which actually even Sheila talked about, how we should find a way of plugging these small-scale producers and traders into big companies so that we have got value chains around, or backward and forward linkages. So thank you so much, Ziad. Now that brings us to Alan, who is going to be our final panelist, and appropriately so, because she talks about money, about financing. So we have heard about all these problems. Now Sheila is going to, Alan is going to tell us how to solve all of them, all of these problems. So how do we finance CBT? What reforms are needed? How can this be achieved? So Alan, you have heard everything everybody has said from Andy, who started off with his very good presentation. Please educate us, please tell us what needs to be done now to solve all these problems.
Thank you so much, Francis, and thank you so much, the speaker. I know Andy and the panelists, very rich discussions here. I mean, for me, this is an area that has been giving me sleepless nights, I must admit, especially in the last year or so when we saw the impact of COVID on these very vulnerable communities. We've seen it just takes one pandemic to wipe away gains that we had worked over the years. And I kept thinking, how we have done inclusion, we have tried to get these communities to contribute to the value chains. But now with just this pandemic, they're back to the base of the pyramid. And so I've been thinking, how can we do financing better? How can we do financing more inclusive? If you look at the kind of financing towards cross-border trade, who is doing big business around cross-border trade? What are the avenues for financing cross-border trade? How can we de-risk cross-border trade? If you look at some of the reforms we've supported in the last years as TradeMark East Africa, we do support reforms that allow for efficiency across corridors, across transport corridors. So for instance, custom systems like ASCUDA supporting governments in the region to put in place those systems so they're able to clear goods faster and you're able to track exports and imports into the country. Or for instance, one-stop border posts at the borders for faster clearance. We have seen times to clear products go down from 3 days, for instance, at Busia to 30 minutes. You're able to clear a truck that is moving, say, coffee from one end to the other, or bringing in consumables or much needed factory inputs. So we really supported trade facilitation initiatives, but we did recognize that these initiatives were actually benefiting big business. The first lot of initiatives we put in place, efficiencies were increased. There was reduction in red tape, there was reduction in bureaucracies along the corridors, but most of these benefits were going to big business. So in our second strategy we started a few years ago, we decided to work with, we increased our support for cross-border trade because we did recognize that without including these communities, there is a challenge. And so we are working with partners like EASSI. And some of the things we have learned over the years is, for instance, the power of the collective. Associations are definitely going to make more sense, especially for these communities. We're not going to be able to work with one trader by one trader by one trader. There are thousands and millions of traders, but if we can work with them in organized settings, and we saw this first in Rwanda through an organization called ProFarm. We also recognize that when pandemics or other issues came up, these cooperatives were more resilient than individual traders. So for instance, an individual trader trading in 10 trays of eggs a day was not as resilient as a whole cooperative dealing in, say, or marketing 1,000 trays a day. They were able to negotiate, they were able to do things different. So we are doing that very well with EASSI and with some of the other initiatives we're working with across the region. However, I still have a big problem, a big question that is haunting me. And I keep asking, the way we support, okay, have we been able to totally de-risk cross-border trade? Are we not keeping trade as micro as it was? Because if you look at all the things, the simplified trade regime, the incentives to remain under the $2,000 threshold are high because you benefit so much. Yet we have seen these ladies, especially the informal cross-border traders, the women, we've seen them grow. They have grown so big. The women I met at the different borders had grown because of the capacity building and all the other initiatives. They had actually grown, but because of the policy frameworks that are in place, they are incentivized to actually remain small. So I'm thinking there must be a problem with the policy frameworks. Can we change them? And Sheila has talked about a good one that I think we could pursue. I've seen the way other economies have grown. The role of big firms cannot be underplayed, what are called export trading groups. These can actually be facilitated with the right frameworks to ensure that they bring aboard smaller firms. So instead of just pursuing, for instance, policies for SMEs, we must ensure that the policies we put in place are holistic to ensure that even as we are supporting these big Africa farms, the 9 farms say Andy talks about, they have in place 30% for small business to contribute into their value, into their chains. If they're doing trade with each other, they must ensure that they also trade with small business. That way, the women who are selling 1,000 trays as a cooperative are able to input into this value chain. So I think if we put in place the appropriate policy frameworks, but also the appropriate infrastructure, we saw how communities of trade have grown so fast with the one-stop border post that we have facilitated. If you looked at the community in Busia, the trade that developed along that community over the last 3 years, it was amazing. If you look at the fish trade, if you look at the grain trade, these are not small, these are multi-million-dollar industries. And they are comprised of thousands of small traders, all trading together. Cumulatively, it comes into millions of dollars. It's just that many times they were often not organized, which Sheila's group is trying to work to, but also in other times, they are not recognized and they are not visible, as Ziad has said. So how do we make them visible, and how do we use these facilities that we have constructed to actually act as catalysts to grow this trade into a more formal setting? And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the appropriate infrastructure. If you look at what they're talking about, Philo talks about what they're trading. Philo talks about many of them are trading in perishables. So you can imagine if you're at the border and you're held up for 10 hours, if it's perishable milk or whatever, it will go spoiled. We know at the border with DRC and Uganda, for instance, a lot of it is in meats, is in eggs, is in fish, and in dairy. Now, if you don't have appropriate cold chain storage, if you don't have appropriate logistics systems, these products are not going to be sustained. So what we need to look at is who is financing this kind of infrastructure at the borders. We've been working on a prototype called Trade Logistics Clusters, where we aim to put in place catalytic facilities that actually spur the growth of trade in that area. And the borders are one of the areas I think we could look at more closely. So let me stop there, but clearly a lot has to be done to ensure that even as we support cross-border trade, we don't support it to keep it micro, support it to grow it. Not that every small trader will export, but if we can plug them into the value chain with appropriate policies, then I think we are onto a winner. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Alan. You have made extremely important points and also shared with us your experience, drawing also or linking also to what Sheila and her organization are doing. But I didn't hear enough about money. Could you mention money, please? How do we finance? How do we finance?
Yeah.
Apart from in addition to trade facilitation, to infrastructure to deal with perishables, to policy frameworks, say for instance, to open that $2,000 cap or threshold, and of course the cooperatives. In addition to all that, is there how do we ensure financial inclusion, for instance? Is mobile money something that's useful? Payment systems at borders, ATMs or things like that. Talk a little bit about money, please. Figures.
That's why I talked about de-risking cross-border trade, because if you're going to bring commercial banks and others, they want to ensure that it's de-risked. And so I had actually the point here on innovations around platforms that allow for banks to be able to track and trace their money, but also in innovations like platforms that allow for easy payments across borders. Now we know that Afreximbank is doing something big for cross-border, for intra-African payments, so that we no longer have to send money through New York, through the main trading centers. But if we are looking at small traders at the borders, they're dealing in, very fast, quickly. They're moving money across. So what kind of platforms can we put in place? So ICT is going to play a very key role as well. Andy has said that as we develop, and I do see it, I mean, in Europe, as we develop, the incentives for cross-border trade will move away. But I still do think that we still have a long way to go, more than a decade or so. And so we do need to put in place appropriate structures and platforms to allow that trade to happen. So yes, we are working on some platforms for information sharing at the borders, and hopefully we can grow these to allow for cross-border payments. So that from shillings to Kenya shillings, or Nigerian to Benin, you're able to actually trade without going through the hassles of losing forex and other money. but we have to invest. So who is there to invest in this? As TradeMark, these are areas that we are exploring. IC is a big part of our next of our work, and this is an area we want to look at more closely.
Right. Thank you so much, Alan. In fact, I heard the other day, there was an event involving the House of Commons where they were saying that TradeMark East Africa should be replicated across the rest of Africa. So there should be TradeMark Central Africa, TradeMark West Africa, in recognition of the excellent work that you've been doing in East Africa. I hope you'll carry forward all those good practices when you go to Central Africa and West Africa.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so now, colleagues, we've come to the end of this webinar. I believe it has been a very productive, very constructive, very informative seminar, which is going to help contribute towards policy interventions that can assist. We started off with Andy, who actually helped us to understand better the values or the measurement of intra-Africa trade. This was really groundbreaking because it took us away from these low figures that we've been trapped in of 18%, 15%, to see that actually in some cases, these figures for individual countries could be as high as 80%, 50%, 30%. So he urged us to unpack, to be always unpacking these figures so that we don't operate on the basis of misconceptions. And then we had Philo, who told us why actually people engage in small scale trade, the regulatory aspects of it, the inconvenience of formal structures, which actually drive people to informality. And then we had Sheila, who actually shared with us her actual experience. She made very big points, including the idea of cooperatives to actually agglomerate, to bulk, and to therefore be able to better service or better provide policy interventions to small scale traders. When you organize them, of course, they also become bigger, they can engage with policy makers. And then we had Jakob, who shared with us his experience of cross-border trade between Uganda and Sudan, how conflict impacted this trade adversely, affecting both people in Sudan who depend on lots of imports from Uganda, including foodstuffs, but also Ugandans who drive livelihoods from selling things into Sudan. And then we had Ziad, who helped us share his perspectives from West Africa, strongly advocating for policy reforms to incentivize traders, but without encouraging them to be too lazy. He also pointed out the need for value chains, which Sheila had also mentioned, as well as the need for simplified trade regimes and other policy interventions. And then lastly, we have had Alan sharing with us what TradeMark East Africa has been able to do, some of the good work that they have been doing, actually transformative work, which has really helped the small scale trade in East Africa, and some of the things that they are planning to do, including in the area of financing and digitalization, especially going forward. So colleagues, I would like to suggest that we bring this to a close, unless somebody has a very, very serious question to ask, or unless, Diana, you believe that we haven't addressed something which needs to be addressed. But before, Diana, you come in, let me ask Webi Chishala. Webi Chishala, yes? Yes, you have put up your hand. Would you like to say something very briefly, please? Maybe Webi Chishala can't talk. Are you able to post something in the chat box or Q&A? But I can see your hand is up.
Hello?
From Zambia. Yes. Yes, Webi, please.
Hello?
Hello? We hear you. Yes, we are hearing you.
Yes, I'm on the line. Are you able to get me? How are you?
We are fine, thank you.
Okay, no, I just wanted to make a request. Okay, I just wanted to make a request. Okay, sorry, I joined the meeting late. I just wanted to request the host to share a link to the video recording so that some of us who joined the meeting late, we can appreciate the insight beautiful discussions
Yes.
that have been deliberated on. Thank
Yes,
you.
Webby. Yeah, thank you for your request. In fact, this meeting has been recorded and we plan to share it widely. It has also been streamed live on YouTube and Facebook. So your request is very much in order and it will be attended to positively. So you can be happy now, Mr. Webby Sheila from Zambia. Right, now we have come to the end of this webinar. Diana, you may wish to close it and then we'll be over and out.
Thank you very much, Doc, for that excellent moderation. And thank you to our panelists for all the contributions. It has been very insightful, particularly the question that Ziad asked us, do we want to have formal cross-border traders that are non-competitive, or do we want to have, informal cross-border traders are non-competitive or formal cross-border traders that are competitive? It's a question that we also need to ask ourselves in terms of the broader scope of policy making. What are we doing to ensure that the policy cycle and the policy implementation stages are actually taking into consideration informal cross-border traders at a very, very high level? Want to thank the participants for this session. You have been very active. I honestly have been following the chat, and some of the questions that were asked, we've not been able to answer them. Hopefully in a future session, we'll be able to answer all the questions that you've been able to raise. I want to also thank the panelists who were able to take their time to be with us here today. They were able to share very good insights right from the front line in terms of what's been happening in cross-border trade. How can other actors get involved? Jakob was able to even give us actual steps in terms of research. If you want to get into the research cycle, what would you be able to do and how can you contribute to this very big discussion? Philomena was able to share with us the report. We'll also be able to send that to you so that you can read the deep insights into what informal cross-border trade looks like in West Africa, which was then compounded by Ziad, who was able to share the perspective as a frontline worker. I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Mangeni, who has been able to moderate this session in an excellent fashion. We admire you across the continent. I can honestly say that as a young person who's been learning under your leadership, we have seen the work that you've been doing and it's been extremely inspirational to all of us. I also want to thank Alan, without whom this session would not have been possible. She's currently the chief of programs at TradeMark East Africa, and is always telling me that she's looking for young talent. So please, if you are interested in what they're doing with TradeMark East Africa, please send her a message on LinkedIn and she'll be able to help you to at least understand how you can contribute. On the background, I want to thank Favor, Ruhu, and Rakeli Kuria, who are part of my team at Africa Young Trade Professionals. They have been able to monitor the session to ensure that nothing goes amiss. And I just have very deep gratitude to each of them because they have been very strong and instrumental in this session. Thank you to our participants. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you everybody. I think we'll now say it's safe to close the meeting, and we'll see you at the next session, which will probably be on industrialization. More details will be shared. Thank you very much and have a good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye and great day for all.
Diana, if you could exit others that we are able to continue with the conversation, and also, yeah, stop the recording and the live streaming.